Welcome, everyone. My name is Nicole Vella, and I am serving as the president of the Reading Georgia chapter. Thanks for joining us tonight as we kick off the first webinar in the Spotlight on Structured Literacy Wednesday webinar series. I would like to thank all of the sponsors and supporters whose generosity made this series possible. Thank you very much. We at the Reading League Georgia are so honored to be co-sponsoring this series with the IDA Georgia. We're so excited to see this partnership grow. The future is so bright. I would also like to take a minute to thank the members of IDA Georgia Webinar Series Planning Committee. Lisa Murray and Kim Day are the co-chairs. Jennifer Lindstrom worked on the speaker lineup. Anne-Marie Lewis is managing registration and certificates. Mary McPherson, thank you for the Zoom support. Jen Birch and Nora Schlesinger are working on sponsorship. And Rachel Pierce and Delilah Landrum, thank you for marketing the series. The focus of this webinar series is to shine the light both on the content and principles of instruction supported in the research on teaching reading. Structured literacy really emphasizes teaching reading skills explicitly and systematically. We're going to hear from some great experts in the field on best practices for teaching reading and writing. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please put them in the chat at any time. The last 15 minutes of tonight's session are reserved for answering questions. Because there are so many people attending tonight, please reserve the chat for questions only. Also, because there are so many people in attendance tonight, we won't be able to answer all of the questions. We've already flagged a couple of questions that Dr. Hasbrouck will address that were submitted earlier. Now, I would like to introduce Dr. Dan Hasbrouck and tell you a little bit about her work. Dr. Hasbrouck is a leading researcher, educational consultant, and author who works in schools both in the US and internationally. Dr. Hasbrouck worked as a reading specialist and a coach for 15 years and later became a professor. Her research in reading fluency, academic assessment and interventions, and instructional coaching has been widely published. She is the author and co-author of several books, curriculum materials, and assessment tools. She continues to collaborate with researchers on projects related to reading assessment and intervention, and she enjoys volunteering with her grandson at his K-8 school in Seattle. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Hasbrouck.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here. So I will share my slides, and so honored to be part and kicking off this wonderful Wednesday study that you have. Very, very important that we keep sharing this important information about helping what we've learned from the science and the research that continues. It continues to this day. So you're going to actually see some updates to my slides if you have copies of the handouts, and I'm happy to share PDFs of my slides with folks. But I'm always reading research myself, attending webinars and getting new, fresh ideas. So there were some updates to my presentation even made today. Some of you may have heard me talk about reading fluency before. It's something I've been focused on for quite a long time, but I'm really now trying to emphasize the connection with reading comprehension. So I've titled this session, Reading Fluency, Essential for Reading Comprehension. That's the actual title of the presentation. We have the hour together today, plus some time for question and answers. So we're just going to touch on this very in-depth, complicated, complex topic. So I did want you to know that there are other resources that you could go to if you want a little bit deeper dive into some of the things I'm talking about today. I had the wonderful opportunity a few years ago now to write with Deb Glazer a book about reading fluency, broken into the chapters about defining fluency, assessing fluency, and 2 chapters about teaching fluency. So that's one source for you. I know at least some of you are members of the Reading League, as I am, and some of you might have access to their journal in at the October 2020 edition. They did a special version, a special issue of the journal that was focused on updating what we've learned from the National Reading Panel report 20 years. So it was the 20th anniversary. And they asked me to write the chapter on fluency. So that's another source in print that you could follow up on after tonight's webinar. So just to get your thinking ready, I've said that this is really going to be connecting fluency with comprehension. So once again, that is underscored here. It's the key takeaway for this session, this really focused session, that really we could go so far as to say fluency only in terms of reading. Fluency really is only important as far as it supports comprehension and motivated reading. Standing by itself, it's very much like many of the aspects of reading in my mind. Phonics is essential for skillful reading, but all by itself, it gets put on a pedestal sometimes and thinks it's all about phonics. Well, of course it's not, nor is phoneme awareness or even comprehension. It's an integrated, extremely complex process. And so it's really best practice and most accurate for us to think about fluency as being important as a support for comprehension and motivated reading. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So if you accept that as the idea, then this idea that if that is true, then all aspects of fluency should be connected to comprehension. The way we assess fluency, the way we teach fluency should be connected to comprehension. And I have a goal for tonight, and I have borrowed this goal from my friend and colleague Anita Archer. I watched I watch many of her webinars, attend as many as I possibly can, but recently she did a webinar with this goal in mind, working with professional colleagues, as I am doing here tonight, that I know many of you come in with a lot of information. So an important and a value, I think, of us who are experts in our field or hoping to become even more expert in our field, that we continue to learn to affirm what we've already know. It's not that everything in this webinar is going to be brand new news for you. I would hope that a significant amount would affirm what you have already learned about this important topic. A second aspect is perhaps to remind you some things that you did learn, you do know, but you haven't thought about for a while, which is perfectly understandable. In everything we focus on and keep fresh and current in our mind what we're dealing with on a regular basis. But I know that I continue to attend webinars and continue to try to learn to expand my learning. So I hope that that is something that happens for you tonight too. So for the time we have, I'm going to focus in on these 3 areas: defining fluency, a little bit about assessing fluency, and some ideas about teaching fluency, teaching reading fluency. So we'll start with the defining. That's always a good place to start. What do we mean by reading fluency? Well, in our book, Deb and I talked about the fact that reading is a highly complex task that involves many interconnected and codependent linguistic processes that draw upon a variety of separate skills. And that statement is never better demonstrated or illustrated by the amazing Scarborough's rope. I did attend a webinar this morning. Well, I guess it was over my lunch period. I live out here in Seattle, Washington, so it was a lunchtime webinar for me. And the presenter used Scarborough's rope as an illustration, which just doesn't surprise me anymore. It is such a brilliant way of demonstrating accurately, quite accurately, all the complex pieces, starting with the big picture. There must be language in place in order for skillful, fluent reading to happen. There must be skillful word recognition for skillful, fluent, motivated reading to happen. And I do appreciate, I know I heard Dr. Scarborough fairly recently talking about her rope, how it came to be, and what she might change about it, since it's now close to, or about over 20 years old. She said at this point she really wouldn't make any changes, but she said the one thing that most people ask her about is, where is fluency in the rope? And she reiterated and explained that fluency is demonstrated by that tightly woven part of the rope, where it's actually labeled that this is the representation of fluent execution and coordination of all the component pieces, the language comprehension and the word recognition. That is a brilliant, accurate, and very, I think for me, because I'm a very visual person, a very good representation of what we're looking for, the target of reading that allows reading comprehension. I think it's important too, one of the things that I think it's key for us to really think about, if our goal is that tightly woven rope and fluent reading, to remember that this process starts really early. The reminder that fluency develops in progressions. We can talk about skill development becoming, the individual skills becoming fluent and automatic. And that starts for what we think about as passage level fluency. It starts way back at the letter level, the sound level, the letter pattern level, the word level, and then phrases where we start to get the grammar, the semantics, and the syntactic processes involved in the learning. So we start with accuracy for each of those component skills, and then we try to move through our instruction and practice to automaticity at those individual skill levels. And then we hope that that leads to what most of us, when we're thinking about fluency, we're really thinking about passage fluency. And Deb and I, define passage reading fluency as reasonably accurate reading at an appropriate pace that happens with suitable expression. And those three things you will find represented in pretty much everybody's definition of fluency. They may be in different order. If you go back and look at the National Reading Panel report, at times they talked about fluency as reading quickly, and then talked about accuracy and expression. And we chose very carefully, as I will explain, to put accuracy first, but including rate and expression certainly. But we went a little further. We believe that from what we know about fluency, it's an important or essential role in overall reading, that we can take it a little bit further in the definition. We say that fluency leads to accurate and deep comprehension, and there's so much evidence that that's true. It's not automatic. It is the bridge, often described as the bridge to comprehension. It doesn't guarantee comprehension. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that needs to happen. But if you don't have fluency, you're not going to have comprehension. So it's that bridge, or it leads to the possibility of deep and accurate comprehension. And then we put motivation on there. There is far less research evidence about motivation. Motivation is apparently something that's really difficult to study because not very many people have. It's hard to really get beyond just opinions or questionnaires about motivation. So when there's not really strong research evidence one way or the other, we as professional practitioners get to use our professional experience, our clinical experience. And Deb and I have both been working with struggling, vulnerable readers for many, many decades. And we both agree that we have yet to find a student who struggles with fluency who is a motive of that connection. We know it's there. So rate and expression as the three main component pieces. But we also, in our definition, talked about defining these terms in terms of reasonably accurate, appropriate rate, and suitable expression. So I want to spend some time explaining what we mean by that. So accuracy is very important, and to underscore the importance of accuracy, bear with me, I'm going to have to say a few F words here with exclamation marks, but nothing, I hope, nothing that will be offensive. When we talk about accuracy, the first F we want to use is that word first. Just like Wolf and a colleague talked about, fluency develops in progressions, those progressions at the skill level and then the integrated skill level. For accuracy is what happens first. And it's the thing we focus on first when we're leading children to passage reading fluency. It's accuracy that has to be established first. If, again, is my message here, that our whole discussion about fluency is about comprehension. Accuracy is essential if we care about comprehension. The second F in this explanation is foremost of all the components of fluency. If comprehension is our goal, then accuracy is most important. Rate is essential. Prosody or expression play a role, but accuracy is really of foremost importance. It doesn't take very much inaccuracy before we can lose the connection to comprehension. So first, foremost, and the third F is forever. So this is not just something we pay attention to in kindergarten and first grade as children are developing those skills. Accuracy remains forever the most important component of fluency, because accuracy serves as the foundation of fluency. So those are those 5 F's that might be a good mnemonic to remember. First, foremost, and forever. Accuracy is the foundation of fluency. So that's what we mean that explains the importance. But what do we mean by reasonably accurate? And here I'm really talking about when we turn students over to read independently, because if they're in front of me, if I have one student in front of me, or a small group of students in front of me, or the entire class, accuracy is, I'm going to aim for most of the time using that opportunity for me to make corrections. I want my students' accuracy to be actually 100%. So I'm going to correct the errors when I hear them. How I correct their errors will be very different when I'm working with a single student or a small group of students or the large group of students. It will depend on their age. It will depend on their level of skill development, but I'm going to correct their errors. When they're off reading independently, I can't correct their errors. So we're really talking here about the level of the level of accuracy that needs to happen in independent reading when there's nobody there, no tutor, nobody to make those corrections. And this comes from research. So we know that we need to teach our students so well that when they're off reading independently, they must be able to read with at least 95% accuracy in order to maintain comprehension. And I know we could spend the rest of our time talking about this alone, because in many minds, it feels like 95% is too high, right? I mean, that we really need to be that accurate. And we really do. There's, if we were doing a full day workshop, there's some wonderful activities that we could do that demonstrates pretty quickly if we don't know or can't identify even 5% of the words, it's going to affect our comprehension. When we take a look at our emerging readers, kindergarten, first grade, just getting started with reading, what's the level of accuracy that researchers recommend here? Well, they're readers, so maybe it's 95%, or they're just beginning, so we should make it a little easier for them. Actually, the research on emerging readers suggests that independent reading, remember, should be even higher for those emerging readers. We can talk about this in terms of two things. One is we just want to control the level of text difficulty that these early beginning readers are reading so that they just don't encounter words that are going to be problematic for them. So part of it is text control, but the other idea has to do with that motivation aspect, that we don't want students on their own, sitting there independently, just beginning this journey of learning to read. We don't want them to feel that this is hard. Later, we want to do all kinds of things to challenge the readers and things like that. But at the early stages, we want them to feel confident and proud and successful in their work. So that's what the research suggests. When we turn our attention to rate, well, if we believed what we see in a lot of classrooms, unfortunately, it would be somebody must believe that we should be teaching our students to read as fast as possible. That is not true. I'm sure that's not new news for most people on this webinar. This brilliant statement, I think, encompasses what we should be thinking about rate better than anything I've ever read. This was Steve Stahl and Melanie Kuhn, who said fluent reading should sound like speech. Absolutely. And that makes so much sense in terms of the purpose of reading, which is to translate print back into our language that we understand. And if reading can't mirror the speech that our brain recognizes, then comprehension is going to be impaired. So it's not reading as fast as possible. It's reading with sufficient accuracy and automaticity to allow the reading to mirror what our brain understands. But that's a real subjective way of looking or analyzing rate. Most of us as teachers, as professional educators, want something a little bit more systematic. So, and when we're talking about rate, we often turn to the idea of measuring the number of words a student can read correctly per minute. And to measure that, many of us use an assessment that was developed close to 40 years ago and has tons of research to validate it, called the Oral Reading Fluency Assessment, or ORF, where students are given unpracticed piece of text to read for just 60 seconds. For most of the decisions we make, we use grade level, unpracticed grade level text. Then we have the students read for 1 minute, we get their score of words correct per minute, and then we have to interpret that score. One way to interpret score is to have some kind of norms. What are the performance standards of other second graders or fourth graders or eighth graders across a year? And this is some of the area where I've focused my research. My colleague Jerry Tindal and I actually have done 3 different studies to establish norms for oral reading fluency, so that we as practitioners can interpret those numbers. My student read 73 words correct per minute. My student read 142 words correct per minute. Is that good? Is it appropriate? So it's for that purpose. Most recently, our most recent study was completed in 2017. It's published as a research report, and I certainly wanted to make available to you the handout. As a handout is our most current version of these norms. So what this current study did, which compiled scores from over 6 million students, was from the middle of first grade through 6th grade, and we assessed these students 3 times a year. And from those 6 million scores, we calculated percentile rankings from the 10th up to the 90th percentile. So the question about appropriate rate, when we're looking at those Hasbrouck and Tindal norms, many people would still think that the appropriate percentile is as high as possible. I mean, we want all of our students at the 90th percentile. That just makes intuitive sense because on most things, that is actually true for human beings. We want to be, it's always best to be at the top. But there are a few things, a few areas where that's not true, and reading fluency is one of them. So what the research says is that the range of appropriate rate that we should be striving for with our students is somewhere between, the sweet spot is between the 50th and the 75th percentile, again, on unpracticed grade level text. And the reason that we have drawn that conclusion is that we do know from our research, I mean, the 3 studies that Jerry Tindal and I did, there are kids at the 90th percentile. What we don't know from the research, we just don't have evidence that those kids way at the top are better readers. And all of you who have listened to children read know that reading fast can be detrimental. Again, if we're concerned about reading fluency, reading comprehension, reading too fast for all of us, even very skilled readers, can limit or impair comprehension. One really lovely piece of evidence about this validation of the 50th to 75th percentile came in a study done, published just last year, looking at the 2018 NAEP scores, which just places kids in categories based on their comprehension ability, puts them in categories of advanced comprehension, proficient, basic, and below basic. But these researchers then went back and found kids who performed at those various levels and did a check of their oral reading fluency words correct per minute scores, and found these scores here. The advanced students in 4th grade were reading at about, on average, 160 words correct per minute. The proficient were 142, the basic were 123, and below basic was whoops, oh, excuse me. What was that? Okay, sorry about that. But that matches up so nicely to the Hasbrouck and Tindal norms. The 75th percentile at the end of 4th grade on our most recent study is exactly 160. And that's where the advanced students, you don't need to be above the 75th percentile. Again, just not evidence of that. But it's so important to try to get to at least the 50th percentile because it's right around the 50th percentile that gets you close to the proficient level of reading and keeps you slightly at the basic level. When the students are falling down around the 25th percentile, it affects their overall reading ability and their comprehension. It could not be more clearly mapped out as it was in this study. But we also know that it is important to get at least to the 50th percentile. And there is significant evidence on that over many, many years that students who fall, and we often say more than 10 words below the 50th percentile, and that was in that White et al. Study, definitely showed that more than 10 words below the 50th percentile has a significantly negative effect on comprehension, and we infer motivation as well. When we turn our attention to the 3rd component of our definition, that fluent reading should sound like speech, we do know that expression is important, but most of the consensus in research right now is that expression is better seen as an outcome of comprehension rather than contributing to comprehension. Basically, meaning that it's really difficult, if not impossible, to use proper expression or prosody if you don't know what the words mean. Should I be excited here? Should I be terrified? Should I sound bored? Unless you know what those words mean, it's really hard to do that. So if you are listening to a student read and they are using good expression, that probably is an indicator that they are comprehending. A very recent study talked about that. The prosodic competence or expression is best seen as making an indirect contribution to reading and reading comprehension, but it's not irrelevant. And certainly as beginning readers, we want to be sure that we are teaching them the importance of those diacritical marks, what a period means, what a comma means, because those make a huge contribution just in basic comprehension ideas. But as we get more sophisticated with reading, prosody or expression contributes far less than the accuracy and rate. But those three things we refer to as the essential main primary components of reading, but it's not that simple. We've got all this other stuff going on in the background that we refer to as the mechanics of fluency, all the phoneme awareness and the orthographic knowledge and the comprehension skills and the language skills. Those mechanics and all of this is what makes fluency so complex. So wrapping this up, the definition of fluency, when we think about the role of reading fluency, we've talked about accuracy, and we know that comprehension is going to be limited by inaccurate reading, and it doesn't need to be very inaccurate. That rate is important because comprehension is limited by rate that is too slow, laborious, inefficient, or reading too fast. And all of you who work with readers probably, unfortunately, have seen this, where our students who lack fluency do lack motivation. And if they lack motivation, they read less. And if they read less, that's going to have an effect on their comprehension. And a smaller comprehension limits, a lower vocabulary then has its own limit on comprehension. And that becomes self-perpetuating. Reading becomes not fun. I don't understand what I'm reading. It feels too hard. So I read less and less and less. So we can take this as the takeaway from this, the role of reading comprehension, the role of reading fluency, comprehension, and motivation. So it's part two, going to turn my attention to assessing reading fluency. And again, when we think about the components, we can most easily measure and get the most bang from our buck from measuring the accuracy and the rate. And we do that typically through that process, assessment procedure I mentioned before of ORF assessment, the 60-second unpracticed grade level passages. And these days we have many commercially available versions of the ORF assessment. When they were first invented, they were just a process that teachers could use with any kind of text. But now publishers have come along and made it a more systematic process. So many of you are probably using at least one of these or have used at least one of these assessments. And because they're so widely used, I wanted to take a bit of our time to talk about 4 very common confusions about the use of the ORF measure. I would say the most common confusion that I hear about is that this measure, the 60-second measure of unpracticed text that we have called ORF, that is actually measuring reading fluency. And no, the answer is actually no. And it's so confusing because the name of the assessment is oral reading fluency, but there is wide agreement that it was really unfortunate that the originators of this assessment named it that. They were misnamed. This is discussed in this wonderful book. If you are a real fan of curriculum-based measurement, or you would just like to know more, this is an essential very helpful practical book on the use of the various CBM measures, of which ORF is one. There are CBM measures of math and spelling and writing, and this book covers them all. But when they talk about oral reading fluency, they agree it was misnamed, and they refer to it in this book as oral passage reading, not a measure of fluency, but a measure of accuracy and rate. Or we could say automaticity. That's what that word's correct per minute, which is a piece of fluency, an essential piece of fluency, but not this complex outcome of all of these component pieces. That can't be measured really in 1 minute, but automaticity we can measure quite accurately in 1 minute. I just feel strongly, and others do too, that if we're really going to do a reasonable diagnosis or assessment of this complex construct that we call reading fluency, that it needs to be more than 60 seconds, because we need to take a look at the mechanics of fluency. We need to look at prosody. We need to connect the reader with assess their level of comprehension, all of those things that the ORF assessment doesn't do. So that's the first and most common confusion. The second, I would say, is the belief that a higher score is better. We've kind of addressed that already, that appropriate rate should sound like speech because of the evidence I showed you before. So no, it's not higher is better. 50th to 75th percentile, it needs to be that high, but not higher and higher and higher and faster and faster and faster. The third most common confusion, I would say, is people's distrust or concern that the ORF measure is taking us in the wrong direction. Many people, and you may be among them, that say, we shouldn't be measuring students' rate. We shouldn't be measuring just their fluency or automaticity. We really should be measuring comprehension. And my response to that is, yeah, we should. The problem is measuring comprehension is really challenging. Comprehension is this extremely complex construct, all of these component pieces in there to take any of these strands and measure them. If we assess a student on a, and we find on that day, what we would call their comprehension was not very good. What does that really mean? And what do we really know? Do we know that everything else is fine, it's just their comprehension? Or could it be that there are some underlying contributions to the fact that they were not able to answer those questions correctly? Or could it be that that student just blew off the test and chose not to answer those questions very well? Or they had a really bad start to their morning? Or there's all kinds of reasons that make measuring comprehension very complicated, because comprehension is very complicated. We do know that we can measure comprehension. Some of you may be in this assessment diagnosticians or assessment specialists. We might have a school psychologist with us tonight. We do know how to measure comprehension, but it's very complex to do it right. We don't just have a student read a passage and answer, a few questions for us. It's much more involved than that. The assessments that school psychologists use to assess comprehension are often well over an hour, up to 2 hours in length, or even longer. So we turn instead, because we don't have, as teachers, most of us don't have that much time to assess. So we turn to other measures that give us a peek into comprehension, a correlation with comprehension, and those ORF measures are one of the things that we use because of the research that we have that shows their strong correlation. This is one of the very close now to 40 years of studies that have been done on that ORF assessment. This is one that was very elegantly designed and really shows how the ORF does give us a sense of students' comprehension, in fact, better than many other more familiar classroom assessments. So in this study, these researchers were looking at fifth graders, all of whom were struggling readers. They were not skillful readers. The first thing the researchers did was to do a true, validated, comprehensive assessment of their comprehension. And that was probably one of those 1 or 2 hour assessments, and they got the comprehension score and wrote it down. Then they did some other assessments to see which one of these other assessments would best predict their comprehension score. So they administered a retell, have the students read a passage, recall or retell what they read, and then correlate those two scores together and to see how they're related. And in this study, the retell correlated with comprehension at 0.70. And those of you who have some familiarity with correlational research know that a 0.70 correlation is pretty strong, that the ability to read a piece of text and retell what was in that text is a reasonably good indication of comprehension. In this case, at the 0.70 level. They administered the close assessment, where you take a passage and remove words and the students literally guess what the missing word is. In this case, that correlated just about the same at 0.72. They had the students read a passage and answer some multiple choice questions. That was a very strong correlation of 0.82. And one of the reasons we do often measure our students' comprehension or knowledge that way with multiple choice questions. But they also did a 1 minute read with the students of unpracticed grade level text, took that words correct per minute score, did a correlation, and in this case, got the astounding correlation of 0.91. A perfect correlation is 1. And you only get that when you correlate something to itself. So getting 0.91 is one of the reasons that this is a very famous study. How in the world can that be, that this simple little assessment predicts comprehension at that level and better than the other assessments did? But the research continues. This was a study done in 2010 with a large number of students, and their ORF assessment in this case was the Dibbles version of the assessment. And they found, again, that they were looking just at grades 1 through 3 with the oral reading fluency. In first grade, the growth rates in ORF across the year best predicted grade 3 comprehension. In grades 2 and 3, it was the fall score alone. But we do have just decades of evidence that ORF, measuring a quick measure of automaticity, accuracy, and rate, really does give us a peek into comprehension. It's not perfect. Especially if our students if we're talking about students such as many of our English learners who may have been so well taught that they have learned to decode even quite fluently, but the top of the reading rope, Scarborough's rope, has not yet been mastered. So they may be weaker on language, but strong in their word recognition skills. They may do quite well on an ORF assessment, but not really be able to comprehend. And there are other issues with it as well. But for the tool we have, for the amount of time that it takes, it is a wonderful tool in our toolkit. So we could talk about more, but I'm just going to quickly address number 4, that when we do find students with low words correct per minute scores, we should immediately put them in a fluency intervention. My answer to that is maybe. Maybe we should. But we need to remember that this very quick little assessment, ORF, is really best conceptualized as a thermometer. And both ORF and thermometers have a lot of things in common. Both of them have proven reliability and validity. Reliability, very, very simplistically, means you can trust the score. And if you give that same assessment multiple times, you're going to get a similar score. It's trustworthy and consistent. Validity means that the score has some kind of meaning. And that's certainly true for ORF and definitely with a thermometer. Another similarity between these two assessments is both of them can be used very quickly. But another thing that we think of, maybe don't think about, is that both of these we need to compare the score to a benchmark. We don't think of 98.6 maybe as the benchmark, but it is a benchmark. It is the average body temperature of a well human being. There's a little bit of variance around it. We don't need to have thermometer norms from birth through senior citizen 3 times a year because it changes. It doesn't change, unlike ORF, which does change, but we do need a benchmark. But the key thing to think about here is that neither of these assessments are diagnostic. Thermometer doesn't diagnose why you have a fever or why you may not have a fever and still have some serious concern. You can have a broken leg, but no fever. But we don't throw out the thermometer because it's not diagnostic. And we need to remember that ORF we really can't use it. I know there are people who do suggest we can, but we really shouldn't. It simply tells us whether our students academically have a fever or not, but not the cause of that fever or what we should do to treat it. So if we find a student is not as tight, as fluent as we would like them to be, they're at this stage of development for their grade level. Does this mean that they are having trouble with fluency? Or is it possible that there are some other foundational contributing components of fluency that they're really having trouble with? So below benchmark ORF score, words correct per minute score, really should trigger some diagnostic assessments to make sure that all those other things are in place. And then we can use our always precious intervention time to appropriately target what that student needs and continue to work with them to pull all those skills together to develop their passage reading fluency. We want to work on all of them, but if we just zero in on helping the students read faster, we can do a real disservice and find that our students don't really benefit that much from what we're doing. So I want to use the remaining of my presentation time to talk about teaching reading fluency and leaving some time for questions. So when we talk about teaching fluency, both Deb Glazer and I are big fans of the work of Roxanne Hudson and Holly Lane and colleagues who back in 2005 wrote this, that the growth of reading fluency in all its multifaceted glory is an outcome of many different kinds of instruction. And that just makes so much sense given the way we've talked about fluency here this evening. When we think back about Scarborough's rope, in order to become fluent, you need to have instruction that addresses at an appropriate level for that student all of these different things. So that's really what they're meaning by many different kinds of instructions. You need to teach differently. What you need to do is teach a bunch of different things in order to end up with fluency. So you need that instruction, but they also said that that instruction must be coupled with large amounts of practice. And they didn't just say practice, they said carefully orchestrated practice. So we can go back to Scarborough's rope, and if we've mastered the underlying or continuing to master and learn the underlying components, and our students are here, this is where the practice happens. They've got the component pieces in place, and we practice to help our students learn to be increasingly strategic, increasingly automatic, and we hope reach that level of the tightly woven rope. So this would be representation of grade level appropriate passage reading. But we're not done when they achieve that. We have to continue to work with them to continue to develop their fluency and improve their fluency, not read faster. Hear what I'm saying? Not read faster, but improve their true fluency, their accuracy, their rate or automaticity, and their expression and their comprehension, all of those component pieces. So when we think about that instruction and practice, I want to talk about instruction first. In our book that Deb and I wrote together, when we talk about fluency instruction, we use this organizer around it. And I really love this idea of AAA. I'm all about analogies and organizers and frameworks anyway, but I can be particularly happy about this one in part because I didn't create it. This is an idea Deb had. I remember the day she called me and said, oh, I think we should talk about reading fluency instruction this way. And I just thought it was so brilliant because in the AAA, there are 3 A's. And I hope you can remember back to the beginning of this presentation where we started the all important aspect of if we truly want fluent reading, not just fast reading, we have to have accuracy. So fluency instruction, whether we're talking about laying the foundation for passage fluency at the component level, we're teaching letter names, we're teaching letter sounds, we're teaching word reading, we're teaching phrase reading. We need to emphasize accuracy. And as we're doing that and the accuracy gets built, we can move at the component level, the phrase level, the text level, we move to automaticity. We maintain the level of accuracy, but bring in rate and continue that weaving together of these component pieces. But we're not done. That's not sufficient for fluency. We have to have, the theme of this evening is comprehension. So she included that in this idea through this idea of this phrase of accessing meaning. So I hope you agree with me that I think this is brilliant. Out of the mind of Deb Glaser. Every time that you are addressing your students' fluency, either at the component level or the passage level, think about accuracy, automaticity, and accessing meaning. We can't do accessing meaning really very much at the letter level or the word level. Well, at the letter level or sound level, but we can start to bring comprehension in at the word level. And I just don't see enough teachers doing that in kindergarten and first grade. We go through this effort, and for young beginning readers, it's a lot of work. They are working really hard just to read that word. We want them always to understand the reason we're doing all that work is because there's meaning on that page. That word you just decoded, dog, a challenging word because it has that stop sound at the beginning, but you did it. You decoded that word. Let's connect that with the students' knowledge about dogs. If they're an English learner, this is a great opportunity to build their vocabulary. We should be doing that, not with all of our time for sure at all, but always having that as a component of our fluency instruction. So that's instruction, but in terms of practice, a lot of times we use independent silent reading as a way of practicing reading. And in the article that I wrote for the Reading League, I did address silent reading by saying that it's perfectly fine for our students with established foundation skills. For these students, silent reading can and does play an important role in improving and strengthening reading. It's not the only thing that should be happening, but for those students who are pretty established readers, giving them some time to read silently can be beneficial. But Mark Seidenberg reminds us that we have to be cautious about silent reading for our students who struggle with reading. He says that children who struggle when reading text aloud do not become good readers if left to read silently. Their disfluency merely becomes becomes inaudible, which another brilliant statement from the brilliant Mark Seidenberg. So what do? We've got kids in our classroom. We've got to think about both practice and intervention for these students. I want to spend some time talking about the kinds of things that classroom teachers can do. You've got all the children there, the children who are on level, the children who are on level with a little bit of extra help, and the children who are significantly below. What can we do for the whole class together to move fluency ahead? Well, traditionally, what continues to be done in a lot of classrooms is round robin reading. And I really don't even want to spend much time talking about why we should really be moving away from round robin reading. There are some real disadvantages to that, and really not too many advantages. We're trying to cover the text. We know that some of the kids in the class can't read the text that well. So but there are other better things that we can do. Anita Archer and Charles Hughes wrote a wonderful book called Explicit Instruction, and they spend quite a bit of time detailing alternatives to round robin reading, including choral reading, where all the students read together following the teacher's voice. Close reading, which is sort of a flip of choral reading. The entire class is reading along, but they read silently while the teacher reads aloud. And then every once in a while, the teacher stops and the students who should have been following along carefully will say that word together. So it has many advantages to round robin reading. Augmented silent reading, they've got some great ideas for doing short little bits of silent reading for some students. Not all students benefit from silent reading, but we can up the benefit of silent reading, even for our skillful readers, by using some of the strategies that they talk about. And then they talk about structured partner reading. And that's, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about that because I have seen such huge benefits from structured partner reading. Different than just turn to the person next to you and read. We have to be a little bit more strategic to get the best out of it. One of the things we need to do is think about how we're pairing the students together. We want to avoid pairing our highest and lowest reader together, which sometimes is tempting. And during structured partner reading, it is quite likely in most classrooms that there are some children who would not benefit from partner reading, even structured partner reading. They're so much lower than their peers that it could be embarrassing or humiliating for them, and it could be frustrating for their peers to work with them. So squeezing out some time to work with the teacher is the idea that I really like. So one suggestion is this idea of taking your students, and this is an actual fourth grade classroom where I asked the teacher, she had 24 students, to just make a list of her students from the highest student to the most challenged reader. And she could have done this based on reading scores, but I said, it's just fine to do it from your understanding of your students, your very top, your middle, your low students. And so she came up with this list. As soon as she had the list, this is what I say to teachers, look at the bottom of your list first before we do anything else. Are there a few students? Is there 1, 2, 8 students who are so much lower than the others that they really shouldn't be asked to do partner reading with their peers? So she identified these 4, Juan, Kaisha, Francisco, and Angelica, as being students that during structured partner reading, she would pull out and do some very valuable, even if it's 15, 20 minutes of more systematic, explicit instruction that they needed. Then she took the remainder of the students, Ebony being the best student in her class, Miguel 11th on the list. So Miguel, or Michael, I guess in this case, Michael is a good, solid reader, average reader. But in every case, from Ebony down to number 10, there's where Miguel is. Miguel is also a good, average reader who's paired with Ashley, who's a lower reader, but not so low that she's going to be embarrassed or Miguel will be frustrated. So we can do a pairing that way. And of course, we don't leave these kids paired this way for the entire year. We make changes, and we might make changes right away, because as soon as you've made the pairing, you need to look at the list and see if these kids will work together. And I do remember this was a real classroom. And I remember the teacher looking at the list and saying, oh, no, number 9, Orlando cannot work with Mary Jane. These 4th grade class, she said they broke up last week, so they can't, it's a little too fresh, they can't work together. So we made some adjustments, and then you need to then take some time structuring what the students read, how long they read, what do they do if they hear an error. This week I attended, I'm always attending webinars, trying to keep learning. I attended a workshop by the wonderful Margaret Goldberg. I'm sure you know, I hope you know her work at the Right to Read project. And she was talking about partner reading, and she said she's using it a lot more with her students. And she uses this process where the students take turns reading. She partners reading very similarly to the way I did. She has this form, which I shared tonight with Nicole, and I want her to share it with you, because I think it's very kind of very useful and self-explanatory, and keeps the kids focused on what they're doing. I'm also a really big fan of the 6-minute solution. Gail Adams and colleagues developed this. This is a commercially available product that you can buy, but built into the 6-minute solution is a wonderful framework where this you collect materials. You don't need to buy their materials. You can make this on your own, but you prepare some materials for the students to read. You select partners and teach them how to do this practice. And then once all that setup has happened, you can get a lot of good practice done literally in 6 minutes, where they read for 1 minute, then the second partner reads, they take turns doing that, they clean up, they're back in their seat in 6 minutes. So it's not a lot of practice. I've heard some people say to me that the 6-minute solution is what they use for fluency instruction. And I know Gail has said, no, it's just practice. It's not instruction, and it's not enough practice to be really meaningful for kids who are behind. But it's a way to squeeze in some really valuable practice in a very short period of time between activities or that kind of thing. I'm just a really big fan. So returning to where we started about an hour ago, I shared that I hoped that the key takeaway from my presentation tonight would be this idea that fluency is of vital importance, but only when it contributes or supports comprehension and motivated reading. And because of that, we want to be sure that all aspects of fluency should be connected to comprehension. And I hope I've showed you a bit of how that can be done in both the assessment and instruction. I was hoping that some of this content would affirm what you already knew, perhaps remind you of some things you had known but forgotten, or it wasn't fresh, highest in mind, or perhaps an idea or two or a resource or two that expanded your idea about this essential component of reading, passage fluency. So I want to thank you very much for taking the time to attend tonight, or those of you who are going to listen to this recording later. I would love to continue the conversation. So those of you who are on Twitter, please connect with me. My Twitter feed is 100% about reading. Although yesterday I responded to somebody doing Wordle who solved it in 3 steps, and I thought that was pretty amazing. So that's kind of like reading, but most of the time you're not going to find any discussions of politics or movie stars or anything like that. It's very much focused on reading. So I'd love to see you there. All right, I'm going to stop sharing now and see what you have for me, Nicole.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Hasbrouck, for sharing your knowledge with us tonight. So for the remainder of our time together, I'd like to share with you some of the questions that were coming in on the Q&A, and wow, it was quite the flood, I have to say. So there was a lot, there's a
Good.
lot.
I'm glad
This
people
is
were,
a
yeah.
good group, and I feel like everybody is all in, and there was a lot of questions. So let me start with this one for you. So how soon should we focus on fluency with emergent or beginning readers?
Okay. Well, I hope that I did address that tonight, and a reminder of where we start with fluency with beginning and emerging readers is we're doing it all the time. The goal eventually, that tightly woven rope, is integration and coordination of all of those skills. But when we're teaching letter names and letter sounds, we should be thinking about getting that component skill up to mastery. So we can think about that as the foundation of fluency. Accuracy first, then automaticity of that skill, and then we introduce a new skill. So, but I'm sure this question was in part, when do we pay attention to text fluency, passage fluency? And we would say, you know, as soon as we have a certain level of that foundation of accuracy laid. And a lot of people have talked about that. In fact, Margaret this week in her presentation talked about kind of the magic threshold as being around 60 words correct per minute. Once they're at that 1 word per second, and they're doing that with at least 95% accuracy, because we never push rate until we have reasonable accuracy, which is 95%, or even a little higher if we're really talking about early first grade. But once a student is at that 1 word per second, we can do things like have them read a short passage or a few sentences and praise them for reading that so accurately and so well. We can access making sure they're accessing meaning by asking them some questions. And if all of that is in place, then we might say to them, I'd like you to read that again. And this time, try to read just a little bit faster. Try to make it sound like a grown-up reading, just that soft, kind of gentle scaffolding toward rate, but only when accuracy is in place and they can access the meaning of what they've read.
So just kind of piggybacking on that, just if you can, I already think I know what you're going to say, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Yeah.
Came in. So in terms of a grade, like what grade would you? I know, but I'm going to ask.
The question that all teachers have, because somebody told, I mean, we need to do grades. We have to do grades. I'm a grandparent now, but I was a parent of kids. I was a teacher. I hated doing grades of my students, but I loved seeing my own children's grades. It's such, it's something we have to do. And I really, that is so complex to say about grading. I want the opportunity to give 2 grades. Here's where you are in terms of your effort and progress, and here's where you are in terms of your relationship to the acquisition of this skill or the standard that we're working on. And those are really 2 different things. If we just say to these kids who are working so hard and putting everything into it and say, well, that's D, because you're not where we expect you to be, it may be. We may have to say, okay, this is below expected achievement, but A+ in terms of effort and energy and growth. So yeah, that's a complex question. I would like to just say, oh, let's just not grade, but I know we have to. But if we can, make sure that we're communicating both those things. Where is this child in terms of the standards acquisition? And where are they in terms of what we can work on, their effort and progress?
Thank you. Here's another question that came in. How do you explicitly teach prosody and phrasing? So what does the explicit teaching and modeling involve?
Yeah, well, it involves explicit teaching and modeling is exactly what it does. That's really the only way. We don't have any magic way. So this is where we can lay the foundation. If there are preschool, kindergarten teachers or parents of young children, they're reading aloud to children and showing them, emphasizing that, stopping between sentences, so that period, and when they get to a certain age, we can draw their attention to it. See that little dot? That tells me to stop and take a breath. We cannot do too much of that with our students, getting them to listen to text being read to them. The workshop, the webinar I attended today was from the folks that do the audible books with humans reading the books, and getting kids plugged into that and listening to reading. When you're reading aloud to students, pointing out to them about phrasing and even modeling a little bit. I don't like to do too much of that, but modeling less skillful expression, less skillful prosody, reading monotone, reading into each other, and not doing a lot of that, but then asking the students, were you able to understand that? Does that sound like I'm talking? So that's another thing that we can do more and more. I think it's good for all of us as teachers as well, is to remember that reading is all about connecting to speech, because that's what our brains recognize. So when we talk about, does this sound like speech? Does this sound like you're talking? Does this sound like language? Does this sound how you talk to your friends? If not, we need to get it that way, because that's what our brains understand. I talk to 5-year-olds that way and 6-year-olds like that, and they get it. They hear, that doesn't sound like you're talking. That's weird. That's robot talk or whatever. Or yes, or when you do that, I don't understand. So we can continue to emphasize that. This is, and I would say the same things to 7th graders or 4th graders in an age appropriate way. But your brain needs to understand what you're reading. You assist by mirroring language, and all those dots and marks on the page help us do that. And when you know the words, the meaning of the words, it helps you do that. This is a word, we're reading a story about anger and fear and rage. And what are we going to do with our voice when we read those words? So it's modeling and explanation, and using an appropriate amount of time for that, because as the research is saying, that's a smaller contribution to comprehension. So dividing our time up that way.
Yeah, there was a question that came in earlier, and it's in the chat, but it's miles up. And it was a question about teaching fluency, or even measuring and monitoring fluency for students who are a little bit older, say 7th or 8th grade.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a really good idea to do a little bit of check. And for some of those students, one of the techniques I have seen Anita Archer do, who works a lot with middle school and high school students, is when they're engaged in silent reading, and she would use augmented silent reading, which is basically setting them up ahead of time to be responsible for their reading. They have to answer some questions, they have to do certain things. When children are silent reading, Anita is not sitting at her desk grading papers. She's walking around, and she has taught the students that when she stops at their desk, they kick into oral reading. They need to read quietly, but enough so that she can hear them. And I think that would be something I rarely see in middle school or upper elementary classrooms that teachers should be doing. Just a little spot check, and you don't have to wait 60 seconds. You will be able to get a sense of, can this student, wait for us, you can look at a sentence or so. Are they reading with reasonable accuracy, which is if they're not, we're in trouble. We got to do something about that. And at a rate that's going to allow their brains to understand what they've read. So we can do very informal spot checks like that at the upper elementary, and then make a little note. I found a student, and if it surprises you, especially, you want to make a little note. Here's a student who's struggling with this, and I want to do, then we can do those 60-second assessments. We can use the ORF assessment with older students. And what we're looking for once we get past 6th grade it doesn't keep changing every year. It's really about 150 words correct per minute. If they can't do that from an unpracticed piece of their text that you're asking them to read, their science text, their social studies text, we should start to think about how can we help this student improve that all-important fluency skill.
Thank you for that. Another question that came in is, how might I better understand and explain the ways in which rereading is different than just memorizing?
That's a really good question. It's a really good question because that is another objection that people have, not only to the ORF assessment, but to the strategy that I didn't really talk about tonight, didn't get a chance to talk about, the idea of rereading or repeated reading, it's sometimes labeled. And an alternative to repeated reading, which takes care of some of those issues around possible memorization, is wide reading. So those are parallel strategies, but in wide reading, the students read a lot, but different passages. But the effect of wide reading is really emphasized when the text is very controlled. So the students are actually seeing the same words over and over again, certain key phrases or vocabulary, so that they have access to that, or they're seeing that level of repetition, but they're not reading exactly the same text. So that's wide reading, and it has some good research validation, but so does repeated reading. There's great evidence of the value of taking a piece of text, having students read it multiple times, and then using that to determine whether setting goals for the students as they're reading that text. But what it could look possibly when you're doing rereading, and we generally find, if I'm remembering the research correctly, that somewhere between 4 to 7 times of rereading is adequate. If the students are not reaching their goal on the 8th time or the 10th time, we need to be looking at something else. But what I have found, and I have used repeated reading extensively, it's one of my key tools in my toolkit. Students don't, they simply don't memorize it. If you're giving them 5 sentences, they might memorize it, but you should be giving them enough of a chunk of text. They may memorize the first sentence or two, and I have students tell me, I have memorized that, and I say, okay, I turn it over and say, tell me. They often get through the first sentence and then they don't remember the rest. But what we do hope is that they are orthographically mapping some of those words, especially the high frequency words that they're seeing over and over again, that those become those instantaneously recognized sight words. We hope that they are memorizing certain words. That's exactly one of the reasons that repeated reading is beneficial for improving reading, including reading fluency. But as far as they're just memorizing, if they are, the text you're giving these students is too simple, or it's too short of a passage. So we don't want them to memorize, except for individual high frequency words. That's exactly what we want them to do. But it can be used. It should be used. It's a wonderful, powerful tool, but tweak it a bit if memorization is a problem.
Thank you. Another question that came in is, this person said they're interested in fluency for progress monitoring in the upper or middle school grades.
Yeah. There is, well, what we know, if you go back to the CBM research and look at studies that continue to be done with CBM, especially the ORF measure that we're talking about right now, there is really good evidence, and some of this was established way back 35 years ago, that ORF measure, as I showed, is very powerful of flagging kids and indicating comprehension, which is what we really care about, up until about 5th grade level reading. Now, some people interpret that incorrectly by saying ORF loses its value after 5th grade. That's not true. It loses its value as a predictor with students who are reading above the 5th grade level. Once a student can read 6th grade text or more or higher, the rate and accuracy is less of a contributing factor to their comprehension. It's a hugely contributing factor up to about 5th grade level reading. So in middle school, we've got lots of 7th, 8th graders on into high school, 9th graders and above, who are not reading at the 5th grade level of proficiency. They're stuck often more around the 3rd or 4th grade level. And for those kids, using words correct per minute as a progress monitoring tool is very valuable and very much an indicator of comprehension, just like in that study that I showed. So that's where we need that. Yes, you can use it. I wouldn't use it it would not have value monitoring at grade level kids, 7th grade and above, 6th grade and above.
Thank you. Could you talk just a little bit about good intervention strategy for students who are dyslexic?
Yeah. Yes, well, there's another hour. We're all going to stay on for another hour or so. One of the things we understand about our students with dyslexia, and this is certainly an area I've done a lot of work and writing and study on for a variety of reasons, including the fact that I have a now grown adult daughter with dyslexia. A general agreement across people who do study our students with dyslexia is that despite our best efforts for many of these students, fluency is one of the things that remains the most challenging goal to reach. We do know about, the wonders of neuroplasticity and early intervention and identification. The research is coming out of so many great places, including Dr. Nadine Gabb's lab that she's working with younger and younger students, is that we can identify dyslexic brains really early. And we know interventions that can close the gap for those students so that they can become, in many cases, fairly prolific and proficient readers. However, for many of those students, even when their accuracy gets to a very strong level, fluency often is a really, really challenging goal to achieve. So that's just maybe a response to whoever asked that question to say, yeah, it's something we do need to work on. But we work on it the same way. We still put the most emphasis on accuracy and comprehension and help our dyslexic students with that, moving toward what Stahl and Kuhn called fluent speech sounders, fluent reading sounding like speech, helping them achieve that, but really making modest goals for those students. I think for many of our students with dyslexia, trying to get as close to the 50th percentile as possible is maybe the best they can do. And it may be, and for some of those students, definitely it is an achievable goal, but it's lots and lots and lots of very focused practice, including repeated reading, works really well, laying that accuracy foundation first and then doing the repeated reading to help their brains retrieve information, which is something that the dyslexic brain just neurobiologically has difficulty doing.
Thank you for that. Speaking about, we need a whole hour because that could be a whole like webinar hour right there. I think this question might also be like that. But we've had several people ask about when you are assessing students who have difficulty with fluency, can you speak a little bit to, would you assess the student at grade level fluency norms and standards, or would you assess the student lower than grade level? And then in addition to that, can you talk a little bit about progress monitoring?
Yeah. Okay. Well, we can use that wonderful measure of ORF, and I don't think I said that, and I want to say it right now, that I said some things about the words correct per measure more ORF measure that might feel like I'm not a fan or I'm disparaging of it. I'm sad that it was mislabeled. I wish that we had called it oral passage reading instead of oral reading fluency, but I think it's a wonderful tool. It is a tool that I use all the time. It is my thermometer. It's just one of the tools in my toolkit, but I can't imagine doing an assessment of a student without using that. But that tool really has two different purposes. One is the way that we're using it widely in screening now. All students, no matter what their level of ability, we give them an unpracticed grade level passage and compare them to established norms or benchmarks and say, this is where you are. You're on level, you're doing quite well, you're not at level, or you're significantly below level. So it screens the children in a way a thermometer would, using grade level text. Once we found a student who is below or significantly below based on the thermometer, the grade level ORF assessment, then we're done screening, and now our attention should turn to diagnosis. And when we're thinking about diagnosis, it's a whole different purpose. Screening is which of all these students might need some extra help. That's the question for screening. Who are our students on level and who are not? Once we found the students who are not, the question changes completely. Now the question becomes a diagnostic question. What kind of help do they need? So if I was working with a fifth grader, we know is dyslexic, I administer the screening assessment using a fifth grade text. We can see that the student is not at benchmark. Maybe we can see that that student made some progress over the last year or not, but okay, they're not at benchmark. That's the screening. Now, diagnostically, we can, in fact, think about using a lower level grade passage. We could use a fourth grade passage, a third grade passage, and then compare how the student is reading compared to other students who do read at that level, and then other diagnostic assessments. Why is it that this student, I think I made him a fifth grader. Why is it that this fifth grader can't read the fifth grade text adequately? Then I would go back to looking at phonics and decoding skills and language skills and those kinds of things. So that's where I would go, thinking about Scarborough's rope, going back to those component pieces and digging around a little bit there to see, are there weaknesses in the contributing strands of reading? Or is it just a rate issue? If it's just a rate issue, we can focus on that, but it rarely is.
Thank you. I know we're getting very close. We only have time maybe for a couple of other questions.
Okay.
Here's one that came in. How are the fluency norms different from Acadience oral reading fluency to other norms out there?
That's a very good question. And so if you're using Acadience or Dibble's 8th or FAST or Ames Web or any of those, each of those companies have created their own norms for their products, and they do vary. They vary. Sometimes if you just look at them, they vary quite widely. So the reason that Jerry Tindal and I started doing our research way back when is that there were no norms at all. There were no commercial products. There were simply, here are the guidelines, you should go do these assessments, but there was no way to interpret them. So originally our purpose was to just create norms so you could interpret those scores. If you're using one of those commercially available products, I would definitely suggest that you use their norms, because they're designed to if they were well created, and I have to assume that most of them were, they were created specifically for those passages. The passages vary, and some passages we all know are a little bit difficult, more difficult than others. So I would definitely use the norms that come with the product you're using, but you can also compare them to the much, much, much larger norms of Hasbrouck and Tindal that don't change all the time. The other thing that the publishers do is they update their norms fairly frequently. They get more data and they change their norms. We've been doing our study every 10 years or so, so they don't change. They're more stable, and they're not product driven. They are compiled norms. So I find a lot of people find value in using their products norms and the Hasbrouck and Tindal norms just as kind of a double check, a way of looking at the same score a couple of ways.
Thank you for answering that. So I think that's all of the time we have for questions, which is kind of a bummer because there are a lot of excellent questions out there. But before we kind of finish up and close out, a comment came in, not so much of a question, but just a comment that I wanted to share with you. And it's, I would vote for a specialized hour addressing students with dyslexia. I would love to hear some research focusing on children with reading weaknesses who also have severe receptive and expressive language difficulties and or retrieval difficulties. So just food for thought for the future.
Your Wednesday lineup.
I know, just, in your spare time.
Right.
But,
well, it's another topic of great interest and passion of mine. So certainly I'd be happy to do that.
Yes. So I think in closing, I think we need to wrap this up and let you go. But in closing, I just want to say that all attendees of tonight's live event will receive an email, and it'll come within 24 hours from the IDA Georgia. That email will include a link to a quick survey request for a certificate of attendance form. So if you do not see that email in your inbox, please be sure to check your junk and spam folders. If you complete that form anytime before this coming Monday, you will receive your certificate on Monday, January 24th. Also, if you have colleagues who missed tonight's webinar, please let them know that all registrants will be receiving a link to the webinar with specific instructions on how to earn a certificate of attendance viewing the recorded webinar. Also, we will send out a PDF file. Apparently, there's a weird glitch sometimes with PDF files in the chat, and so that will also get emailed, Dr. Hasbrouck's PDF that she was sharing with everyone. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for attending tonight's webinar. We really appreciate your support, and we applaud your thirst for knowledge. And again, thank you, Dr. Hasbrouck, for so generously sharing your time with us tonight. Thank you very much, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.